Hi, everyone. I'm Joanne Baumgartner with Wild Farm Alliance, and we're excited to offer this webinar today about riparian and hedgerow habitat that provides benefits to the farm. Thanks to all you for joining, and thanks to our speakers. I am going to share my screen. Working. So, just to give you a little background, Wild Farm Alliance has this bold 2050 vision where we want to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms and hedgerows to the moon and back. But what's relevant for today's webinar is restoring the lifeblood of the landscape, or riparian habitats. And there's about 1 million river edge habitat on farmland in the US, and we'd really like to see about 10% or 100,000 miles of this habitat be restored. So that's a big goal, but as you're going to hear, riparian habitat is super important for birds and other species, and it is also we're going to hear about benefits to the farm. Our speakers, Wendell Gilgert, who's Emeritus from NRCS and Point Blue, is going to talk about riparian bird species and how to support them. Hamutahl Cohen from UCANR, along with Christian Cormeir from Cal Poly Pomona, will talk about research focusing on birds and insects that use riparian habitat and adjacent hedgerows. Avocado and citrus orchards down in the Fillmore area. And Jenni Phillips from Point Blue is going to talk about how she is helping to plant this habitat, both riparian and hedgerow habitat. There are some learning objectives that we hope you all will leave with. So they are I can't see this. How to use birds to measure health of a riparian habitat. That's Wendell, and he's going to talk about the different kinds of structure in vegetation that is supporting this big diversity of species. We're going to hear from Hamutahl and Christian about their research specifically in these habitats along riparian areas, and what are the benefits, what are the beneficial and pests, insects, and birds there. And they're just getting started on their studies, so but it's super exciting to hear about what they're looking at and how they're going about it. And then lastly, with Jenni, we're going to hear about the design considerations and how to implement these plantings and this really cool program that she leads, the STRAW program, Students for Teachers Restoring a Watershed. So I am going to hand it over to Wendell so he can get started with his presentation.
Let me see here. I'm going to diminish this. Good morning, everybody. Going to kind of go through this really quickly. Got about 15 minutes to talk to you about riparian bird focal species. Let's see. I'm going to guess most people know about riparian areas, particularly here in California. We've lost over 90% of our riparian wetlands. You can see the map on the left from the Partners in Flight showing the different regions: Sac Valley, San Joaquin Valley, Salinas Valley, down in Southern California. Get up into Northeast California and Humboldt, Del Norte County. You can see the losses haven't been as great. For those of you, I'm not going to insult you by thinking you don't know what riparian areas are, but just in case there's somebody out there who doesn't know, it's the area between the aquatic habitats and upland habitats, often characterized, particularly in our part of the world, by cottonwoods, willows, alders, Oregon ash, and other places, higher elevations, aspen, spruce, birch, other kinds of woody trees and shrubs. So they're really important. I like to think of them as arteries in the land. They serve as habitat in the west of the 100th meridian. Over 70% of all wildlife use riparian habitat at some point during their life history. And it's really accounts for, again, west of the 100th meridian, which is take a line down the middle of North Dakota, South Dakota, down into Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. There's kind of a dividing line between the dry half and the wet half of the country. In our dry half, in this west of the 100th meridian, we have about 1% of the land is riparian. So it's really, really extraordinarily valuable. It's a conduit for not only fish and other aquatic species to move through, but all kinds of other wildlife, birds, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, all use these as corridors and a conduit. They can also be filters and barriers for movement of animals, but they also can filter sediments and other kinds of things that might get into the waterways before they get into the waterways from surrounding cropland and other land uses. They can be sink habitat if there's not a lot around it. Over time, we can see the losses of different kinds of habitat, but if it's in good shape, we can see it as source habitat as well. Here's a photograph of a nice area that still has its riparian, a lot of its riparian habitat in use. We worked with, when I was with the NRCS, Bob Snikus was the national landscape architect, and we put together this idea of, we decided to work with landowners. If landowners actually wanted to do some things for riparian habitat, they could really change how that looks by planting those habitat areas with trees and shrubs. And I think Jenni's going to talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation today. So we're talking about specifically about birds. Why do we care about birds? Because they are excellent indicators of ecological health. They respond relatively fast to ecological change. As we've planted, many of you have worked with riparian restoration projects, and as you add elements, trees, shrubs, forbs, legumes, other kinds of things into those habitats, you start seeing the birds respond fairly rapidly. We care about birds because they're highly visible and audible. Often we don't see them, but we do hear them, and they make it easy for us to monitor and determine whether they're present or absent. They're charismatic. Public likes birds. They're easy to get support from the public, as opposed to, say, some of the reptiles are, make people a little bit squeamish. And monitoring a suite of focal species, which is what basically the focus of this talk is. Focal species are common birds, mostly common birds that we use to differentiate different ecological requirements that we can evaluate and guide management strategies. The focal species approach is a suite of species, focal species, that represent a range of critical habitat elements: understory, mid canopy, upper canopy areas. It does include species of risk, umbrella species, surrogate species, and common species that are easily monitored. We're managing for the needs of focal species that will improve conditions for the overall community, and presence and absence of focal species can be used as a metric for evaluating ecological condition, which can relate to management practices. So there are a whole suite. There's the Natural Resources Conservation Service and Point Blue Conservation Science put together these handy handouts. This is part of a two-sided handout let's see here. That's the other side of this handout. I'll give you a link in the chat on where to find these so you can download it. But the riparian obligate species that they only use riparian areas are things like the yellow warble. And so as you look at them, you can see some of the identifying characteristics. They're yellow, they've got reddish streaks on the breast, where the nest sites are, the time of year that they're in these riparian areas, and what kind of plants that they utilize for their life history requirements. Common yellowthroat and chats are birds that are secretive, but they have really distinctive calls and pretty easy to detect them when they're vocalizing, especially during the nesting season and they're trying to attract mates. A song sparrow is another one of the ones that are really common, and we see them in a lot of riparian areas and other wetland areas as well. Black-headed grosbeak. Some people confuse their vocalizations for American robins. They're very similar, but when you get into riparian areas, and you'll hear the black-headed grosbeak fairly often in their vocalizations. Blue grosbeaks are a little less common here in California, but we do detect them fairly frequently. Warbling vireo. So these are all birds that are only use riparian areas for nesting. Some of the other ones that will use these areas for nesting, lazuli bunting, they're a beautiful bird with the blues and the rust color on the breast. They like areas that are utilize have a lot of the berries, blackberries, gooseberries, other kinds of shrubs that produce berries. Rancher that I work with that has mulberry, and the mulberry trees are just mobbed by lazuli buntings during the time of year when those berries are ripe and ready to go. Nuttall's woodpecker, of course, this is also a species, a focal species for oak woodland in California. So they do utilize oak woodlands as well as riparian areas. Aster-throated flycatcher is another one of those birds that uses the oaks as well as the riparian areas. And things like Bewick's wren and spotted towhee will utilize a number of different kinds of site, but they are often found in riparian areas. So one of the things that we think about when we want to protect these riparian areas is we're looking at getting to know these birds, getting to know their life history requirements, and what kind of habitat they use. So we look at, this is a little schematic that's in the California riparian bird Partners in Flight document. And if you look, you can see that spotted towhee, for example, it likes to use, it's a ground nester. The willow flycatcher, as suggested, will nest in the willows. Swainson's hawks up in the canopies of cottonwood. Things like the black-headed grosbeak are another one that will use willows. So you can look along this diagram and see where these different birds use. The things like spotted sandpiper will use like the gravel washes in the meanders of the different riparian areas. So there's a whole number of these. These are not all of the focal species or riparian focal species. The Riparian Bird Conservation Plan put out by California Partners in Flight has exhaustive descriptions of these birds and their life histories and things to do to try to make their habitat more beneficial. There's a web link here that takes you directly to this plan if you'd like to get to it, or you could just simply say, okay, the Riparian Bird Conservation Plan, type that in and it should come right up for you. The other one, I'll drop in the chat, the the two-sided handout. We laminate those on both sides and make it available to farmers and ranchers to throw on the dashboard. They can look at them and say, oh, that orange black-headed bird, oh, it's a black-headed grosbeak, or that yellow bird, oh, it's a yellow warbler. So kind of gives you an idea. As it can be a very useful tool, and also has some information about, managing during the nesting season, which is late March in some cases to early August, and also some of the things that you can do to enhance those habitats.
We're going to have Hamutahl and Kristen speak next. I did want to mention that we're going to have questions and answers to your questions at the end of the last presentation. Okay, Kristen and Hamutahl.
Thank you so much for having us today. So I'm Hamutahl. I am the entomology advisor with UC Cooperative Extension in Ventura, and I'm co-presenting with Christian Cormeir. He's a graduate student at Cal Poly Pomona working with the Scardato lab. Today we're going to be talking about some of our research on how non-crop habitat impacts birds and insects. So we all know that habitat loss is a pressing issue in California. Some shocking stats that I recently learned. California has lost 90% of its coastal wetlands and inland wetlands, 99% of its riparian areas, and most of its native grasslands. Currently, about 40% of California's available land is used for agriculture. I really like this map. It shows human impact on the state. If you scan over the map, you can see that the biggest human modifications, the red colored areas, those are around urban cities and around agricultural zones. Ironically, the habitat that we've lost is a critical reservoir for the organisms that provide essential ecosystem services to agriculture, such as insect pollinators and insect predators and parasitoids and birds. We know that many of the organisms impacted by habitat loss provide pest control. So while some species of insects and birds are pests themselves, the vast majority of species are beneficial. For example, more than 50% of bird species are predominantly insectivorous. About 75% of bird species occasionally consume insects. There was a recent study showing that birds globally consume approximately 28 million tons of insects in agricultural areas. In addition to birds, we have insects that eat other insects, like this ladybug here. And we have insects that parasitize other insects as well, such as this tiny little wasp laying its egg inside of an aphid. So our research group is really concerned with, in these degraded landscapes that we have, can we bring back these beneficial organisms? And can we boost ecosystem services such as pest control? And specifically, do both small scale and large scale restoration efforts work? What do we mean by small scale restorations or habitat enhancements? In an agricultural environment, a small scale habitat enhancement might mean something like a flowering strip of non-crop plants or a temporary flowering cover crop. For this study in particular, we honed in on farms that are using hedgerows. These are kind of like a popular form of habitat diversification. They're strips of perennial plants, usually drought tolerant, sometimes natives, that farmers grow on field margins. And they've been found in several studies to create habitat and attract beneficial insects and birds. There's some challenges with them as well. They can require maintenance. They might not be effective without larger patches of habitat nearby that act as a source of beneficial organisms. Maybe they're crop dependent. They work better in some crops than others. And then in terms of large-scale habitat enhancements, we know that many organisms, particularly birds and insects, disperse and forage over many miles for food and nesting resources. For this reason, the quality and quantity of habitat in the larger landscape around farmland is likely critical for their ability to persist. In Ventura County, we have the Santa Clara River, which is a major conservation and restoration target, and it likely acts as a habitat for many animals that frequent and visit adjacent farmland. So our study, it's ongoing. It's designed to assess and compare the impacts of large and small scale habitat patches on birds and insects and the services that they provide. So we're working in lemon and avocado farms in Ventura County, and some of them are near the river, and then some of them are far. So we can look at impact of distance to riparian habitat. And then some of our sites have hedgerows and vegetated natural margins, and some don't, they have bare margins. And then we're also looking at the actual riparian areas themselves to compare what organisms are found in these environments. At each of our orchards, we are assessing pest control outbreaks, pest outbreaks and pest populations by working with PCAs to collect pest data, and then also by collecting insects as well. So that's my part of the project. And then Christian is measuring bird diversity across our sites, and he's going to talk about that research. And then in addition to myself and Christian, we have a whole team of other faculty and students working on this project. So we're not only looking at birds and insects, we're looking at pollinators, we're looking at small and large mammals, and we're looking at bats as well. And we're examining how all these different organisms are impacted by these small and large scale habitat patches. And so we can ask, are our pest outbreaks and our biodiversity suppressed or enhanced in orchards that are close or far to the river, that have hedgerows or that are bare? You know, are these sites more or less diverse? And with that, I'll hand it over to Christian.
Great. Thanks, Hamutahl. Yeah, like she said, I am a master's student at Cal Poly Pomona, and my research focuses on the birds and the orchards in the Santa Clara River Valley. And next slide, please. So, and you can click through about 3 times on this slide. So before you even, obviously having birds in agriculture and your agricultural setting has pros and cons. Having aerial insectivores or birds of prey or terrestrial insectivores can help with pest control, but having birds that cause crop damage like starlings or can spread invasive seeds like white ground sparrows, or even be a health hazard in and of themselves like crows can be a negative. But before we even want to go about asking which birds are good to have in orchards and which birds are bad, we need to know how many are showing up in and where. So the main question we wanted to start with was how many birds are actually occurring in orchards in both species richness and abundance. Next slide, please. And so Hamutahl already introduced the study design. We have about 20 transects throughout the Santa Clara River Valley, 8 in avocado, 8 in lemon, and 4 in riparian areas. And on these transects, you can see at the bottom right corner here, the general design of where I am doing my point counts here. So at 0 meters on the transect, which starts at the edge of the orchard, the transect goes 150 meters into the interior of the orchard, and I am doing point counts at both of those locations, at the edge and in the interior. And I'm doing point counts about 5 minutes at a time, and within those 5 minutes, I'm recording each species seen and heard within 50 meters of that point. And just as a reminder, all of our orchards are adjacent to either other orchards, riparian habitats, or scrub habitats throughout the valley. Next slide, please. And so to start out, I'm going to be showing some data from the project thus far. And to start out, I'm just going to answer the question, which habitats have the most species that we have here? Next slide, please. So to start out, I'm going to go walk through this figure real quick because there's a decent amount going on here, but there's also a lot of really cool information here. On the bottom portion, we have the results of the data from each of our habitat types. On the x-axis, this is the habitat type of one of our transects. Each point is a transect. And on the y-axis, we have the number of species found at each transect. And then the bold black lines are the means of this data. And then the boxes are the 95% confidence intervals. And the way you can interpret this is if the boxes in one category overlap with the black lines of another category, then the difference between those means is not significant. And then on the top portion of this graph, we have our effect size. So on the left side, you can see the comparisons of the 2 habitats. So the top line saying avocado versus citrus. This is comparing the means of those 2 habitat types. And then on the top line as well, on the top line, you can see the number of species. This is the difference between between the means of those two habitat types. And the dot with the number above it is our statistical significance. And if the line on that portion overlaps with that dotted line that goes vertically, then the result is not statistically significant as well. And so from this, we can see that our riparian habitats have a greater number of bird species overall compared to our avocado and our citrus habitats. And that our avocado and citrus habitats, our orchards, do not vary significantly in the number of species that they have. And then we can also see that our riparian habitats have a little under 10 more species on average compared to our orchard habitats. So this was not super surprising. This is kind of what we expected. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look at how many individual birds show up in these habitat types. This is just a total number of birds that show up. And so similar graph, we can see a very similar pattern overall. This is just the total number of individual birds that show up. You can see that our riparian habitats have more on average compared to our orchard habitats. Again, somewhat unsurprising. But we can also see, if we look at the top portion, that riparian habitats have on average about a little over 60 to 70 number of birds on average for each of our transects. Next slide, please. And so now we want to look at kind of how similar these bird communities are to one another, just to kind of see how different they can be within our habitat types. And for that, we have what's called a Bray-Curtis non-metric multidimensional scaling plot. And so what this is, each point on this plot represents the species richness and abundance of the bird community at each of our transects. So each point is a transect's bird community. And the distance between each point represents how different those communities are from one another. So you could see the blue point on the right is very far away from the green point on the top. That's saying that that riparian bird community on the right is very different from the avocado bird community on the top. And from this, we can kind of see that there's a lot of overlap in our avocado and citrus habitats, and that our riparian habitats are more distinctly different from those communities. But what you can't see, because the labels are removed here, is that the transects that are actually physically closer to riparian habitats have bird communities that are more similar to riparian bird communities. So that was pretty cool to see so far in these results. Next slide, please. And so far, we've determined that lemon and avocado orchards have similar bird species richness and abundance, and that our riparian habitats have, unsurprisingly, a greater number of species overall. And that orchards closer to natural areas have bird communities that are similar to the bird communities in riparian areas. And so now we wanted to look at what birds are showing up on the edge, how many birds are showing up at the edge of orchards compared to inside the orchards themselves, because birds that were providing ecosystem services, we want to see if they're actually going into the orchards. So all the data you've seen thus far have been both points on that on our transects put together, but now we're going to be separating them out. So on the left side, we have the species richness plots for the edge of the orchards versus the interior. And from here, we can see that our edge points have a greater number of species overall, a little over 5 more species on the edge versus the interior. And then on the right, we see, again, a similar pattern in total abundance of birds, where there are more birds showing up on the edge of orchards versus the interior. Next slide, please. And so now we wanted to ask if the nearby habitat type mattered for these results. Does this change anything? Because as a reminder, all of our orchards are either next to a riparian habitat, a scrub habitat, or an orchard habitat. And so we wanted to see if this influenced the results in any way. And so I'll quickly run through this again. This is our number of species for our edge and interior points. The plot on the left has our edge points, and the plot on the right has our interior points. The bottom axis this time, instead of being the habitat that the orchard is in, it is the habitat that the orchard is adjacent to. So if you could see, the points that are in orange are orchard habitats that are adjacent to other orchards. Points that are in blue are orchards that are adjacent to riparian habitats, and points that are in green are orchards that are adjacent to scrub habitats. And from here, if we're looking at the left side of the figure, we can see that both our scrub and riparian orchards that are adjacent to those habitats have a greater number of species on average compared to orchards that are adjacent to other orchards. And that the number of species is a little under, they have a little under 10 more species than orchard adjacent orchards. And on the right, we see the interior points. So the birds that are actually going into the orchards, we do see a drop off. The number of species going into orchards is less in general, but they are still greater on average compared to orchards that are adjacent to other orchards. We can see that our scrub habitats have about 7 more species on average going into the orchards than orchard adjacent habitats. And then though the difference between the means is not statistically significant for orchards adjacent to riparian habitats, they still have on average about 4 more species than orchard adjacent orchards. Next slide. And for the total number of individuals, again, we see a reflected pattern. We pretty much see the same thing. There are more individual number of birds in orchards adjacent to riparian habitats and scrub habitats, and they are also going further into the orchards as well. And so you've seen a lot of graphs so far. I'm sure you're all wondering, where are the actual pictures of birds? I just want to see some bird pictures here. So worry not, I have some. And I'm just going to be going through the top 5 species per orchard habitat and riparian habitat, just by raw numbers from what I've been able to see out there. And so in our orchard habitats, in order of abundance, we have the lesser goldfinch, house finch, yellow rump warbler, which is our winter migrant species, one of them, the bush tit, and the dark-eyed junco. You can see that the lesser goldfinch is by far the clear winner in terms of abundance for what you're seeing in orchard habitats. And then for our riparian habitats, we actually see somewhat similar numbers of birds. The lesser goldfinch, once again, very high. The yellow rump warbler, the song sparrow, which Wendell mentioned as one of the focal riparian species, the bush tit again, and then the red-winged blackbird, which shows up in pretty great numbers in a lot of riparian and reed habitats. But you'll see that although they are in pretty great numbers, there's actually lesser goldfinches overall than in orchard habitats. And you might think like, wait, weren't there more individual number of birds in riparian habitats? But there are also a greater number of species overall, so that number of total individuals is spread out over a lot more species. And so I think so to sum up, the species richness and abundance of birds is greater in riparian habitats, and orchard crop type is not hugely important for species richness and abundance from what we've been able to tell. The orchard bird communities that are closer to riparian areas are more similar to those riparian bird communities, and that birds we found that tend to go further into orchards when adjacent to riparian and scrub habitats. And with that, I just want to thank everybody that's been involved with the project thus far, including Hamutahl Cohen, who's on the call here. And that's about it.
Great. So back to me, I'm going to talk a little bit about my part of the research project, looking at insect dynamics in these farming systems. This is work I'm doing with Adam Lambert at UC Santa Barbara. And our work is a little further behind Christian's. We just started this summer. So what I'm sharing with you is very preliminary. But the questions that we're asking for this project have to do with the impact of hedgerows and natural habitat on insect abundance and diversity in the field, including pests, pollinators, and beneficial predators and parasitoids. Today, I'm going to focus just on the top question. Do sites with natural vegetated margins have more insects than sites with bare margins? Mostly because we're not done collecting and processing our traps for answering these other questions. So we use a suite of different methods to collect and sample insects. To assess bee and fly pollinators, we use pollinator traps. They consist of bowls and hanging blue vein traps that are left out in each field for 6 hours. To assess beneficial and pest insects, we use yellow sticky traps, which we leave on trees in the orchards for a week. And then to assess pressure, we're utilizing PCA scouting records at each site. This gives us measurements of pest outbreaks that are similar to what growers use to make decisions. I'm going to talk about the sticky trap data today. This is what a yellow sticky trap looks like. Each trap captures hundreds of insect specimens, which we identify to species when possible. So far, we've processed our avocado traps, and we found that there's like a minimum number of beneficial species that we're finding. Right now, that's about 2 at each site. The maximum is 8. For pests, we see 6 to 11 species on each trap. Now, when we look at just the sheer number of insects, just insect abundance, we can ask if sites with hedgerows and vegetated margins have more insects than sites with bare margins. These are box plots. They show the spread of data, and the middle line is the median. So the plot on the left is showing that there's a higher number of insects at sites with vegetated margins. And the plot on the right shows that the number of species is higher as well. So what happens if we run this analysis on pest insects specifically, and then on beneficial insects? Well, we see the same patterns. For pests, these are some of the top species that we see at our sites. We primarily find lots and lots of different thrips species, with the most abundant species being avocado thrips. Indeed, when we subset our data, as expected, we see that pests follow the same pattern. There's more pests in a field next to natural margins. Okay, what about natural enemies? We have a really nice diversity of predators and parasitoids at our sites. For example, we have spiders and beetles and hemipteran predators and predatory thrips, and these all control and exert biological control on our pests. So we're finding the same pattern with natural enemies. So at sites with non-crop vegetation on the margins, we're seeing higher amounts of natural enemies as well. Right now, these results, they're not quite significant statistically, but again, we haven't processed that many of our traps yet. I think once we have more data from our year-round sampling efforts, we'll be able to say if this is a real pattern or not. So what's next on this project? Like I mentioned, we're still in the early stages. We're excited to address some of these other questions. We want to see if these patterns are the same in citrus and in avocado. Is natural habitat more important than local scale habitat? Are they both important? And then just really quickly, I wanted to mention some of the other work that our group is doing. With Adam Lambert, we're processing pollinator samples from our sites. We found over 60 fly and bee pollinator species so far, just in avocado alone, which is an incredible amount of diversity. And it looks like, you know, many of these species likely benefit from small habitat enhancements, especially if they have short foraging ranges. Our bat team, led by Rachel Blakey, is using ultrasonic sound detectors to collect bat recordings in the orchards and then decode the bat calls with an automated algorithm that identifies the specific species that are calling. They found about 15 bat species so far using the orchards. Bats like the Mexican free-tailed bat, the Yuma myotis bat, and big brown bats. We know that bobcats are present in the natural areas around Ventura, but we know a lot less about how do they utilize and traverse through farmland. So one of the graduate students in our team, supervised by Rachel Blakey, will be studying their movement. Ted Stankiewicz and his student Mackenzie Clark are studying mammals using trail cameras and drift fences. And they're seeing a lot of deer mice and shrews and rats and rabbits, but they're also seeing larger animals like deer, coyotes, skunks, and even mountain lions using these farms. So we're really excited to see how all these different organisms are being impacted by habitat. And with that, I don't know if we have any time for questions, but I think we might be over time.
Yes, you could put your questions in the chat, and we will also have questions at the end after the next presentation. So that was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much. I loved hearing about this research, and it's so important for us to understand how these natural systems are impacting agriculture and supporting the wild of our world. Great.
Okay, so again, my name is Jenni Phillips. I'm a senior project manager with the STRAW program at Point Blue Conservation Science. STRAW is an acronym. It stands for Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. Point Blue is headquartered in Petaluma, California. We have folks working all around the state and working land systems, ocean systems, and much, much more. So my program, the STRAW program, we're doing a lot more outreach, environmental education, and we're the boots on the ground for community-based habitat restoration throughout the state. I've been with Point Blue for about 11 years. I absolutely love what we do. And it's my honor to get the opportunity to work with farmers and ranchers, local resource conservation districts and others to plan these types of projects and implement them and get the community involved. So for my, let's see, now we're going to advance the slide. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. So Joanne outlined these earlier, but these are the learning objectives, hoping each of you walk away with a couple things from my presentation. First, to just be familiar with all that goes into the planning and design and implementation for hedgerow and riparian projects. And then secondly, to share a little bit more about our straw program and other community-based restoration efforts in the state and resources to support landowners as they're doing this work. And this was covered in the other presentations, but just to recap, what is a hedgerow? Basically a row of trees and shrubs, grasses and forbs, typically along a road or a field edge. You might have heard them called a hedge or a windbreak. Why plant a hedgerow? This is covered a little bit earlier too, but here's a short list, and there's so many more reasons, but mainly to create habitat for pollinators and wildlife, create sort of a buffer for dust or pesticide drift, pollution, or as a border between neighboring operations. Planting plants improves soil health and increases biodiversity. The picture on the top right is just a stock photo, but I wanted to show it because it has such a cool representation of the different species you could put in a hedgerow. So you could put anything from, something really tall like trees to medium-sized shrubs to grasses and smaller forbs. So that's kind of the fun part of planting these hedgerows is how you want it to look. The photo on the bottom is a hedgerow that was just a single strand hedgerow that was installed next to an irrigation ditch. And that farmer was really concerned about erosion on that corner of the property. So there's many different functions of hedgerows. So I'm going to try to fit in riparian. Wendell laid a good foundation here, but riparian, again, just the area next to a creek or a river. You might have heard it called a riparian buffer zone or riparian corridor. And why plant in a riparian area? Similar benefits to hedgerows, habitat and biodiversity and improved soil health. Erosion control is a really big one, especially if you're trying to, address specific areas along a creek line on your property. Filtration to waterways, having plants there helps filter the water before it enters the waterways. And there's different species that do a better job of that. Increased surface water filtration. So again, all those roots from those plants are providing little pathways for water to percolate and be stored in the ground versus washing away downstream. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about the design considerations for both hedgerow and riparian projects. I loved the schematic. I linked the website that you can view this on, and I can share this around, but this is kind of getting at, where do I plant a hedgerow on my property? And again, we're thinking about field edges, along roadsides or fence lines. Bottom right, the unproductive areas. Sometimes you might have a space on your farm where you can't get a tractor in there. It's not a good spot to plant crops. So put a hedgerow there. And different waterways, ponds, again, kind of creating that habitat buffer. Other considerations too, you want to think about irrigation. To get your hedgerows established, you really want to plant to water for 2 to 3 years to get them established. So planting near a water source that's easy to get to and reliable. And then knowing your soil, that's going to help dictate what species are going to do the best. Soils that are more fast draining are going to do better with other species than something maybe like a heavier clay soil. So that's a big consideration. For riparian systems, a little bit different. What you're thinking about is, the space that you have to work with. What are the goals that you want to address? Is it an erosion problem? Is it building wildlife? or sorry, wildlife habitat. And so the photo on the left is a project that we have in Gilroy, working with a farmer there who was very open to expanding the wildlife corridor, this riparian buffer, and taking some land out of agricultural production to do so. Because Point Blue is a nonprofit and we get grant funding, a lot of the grants are supporting, wildlife passage through floodplains and things like that. So that is wrapped into the goals for these projects. But again, on the photo on the left, this is going to be a more large scale riparian planting, plants pretty spread out, trying to cover a large area. Whereas the photo on the right is a project we have in Coyote Valley. We don't have much of a riparian margin to work with. This is Fisher Creek, and there's probably about 30 to 40 feet between the creek and the alfalfa operation they have out there. But our strategy here was to do a denser planting. So pick a size. We did like a 60 by 25 foot vegetation plot, and it was focused on a pollinator planting. So planting a lot of more low growing species that flower at different times of year and attract pollinators and different thinking back to Wendell's presentation, thinking about the different focal species that we want to attract in, and knowing that different species live in different parts of the canopy is a really important consideration as well. All right, other forms of design considerations, we want to think about water. The photo on the left is, getting us set up for a hedgerow. So really you just need a single strand poly drip line for that. Each little pin flag there represents where a plant will go. And then on each side of the pin flag, or when the plant is planted, you'll have an emitter on each side. So it's a really basic setup. We do something similar to in riparian plantings. But where's the water coming from? So the photo on the bottom in the center here, sometimes we put in the effort to put in water tanks, especially if we're looking at a system that we want to maintain long term. But you can also play with, can that water be used to fill water troughs and things like that? So there's multiple benefits to setting up irrigation infrastructure on some of these projects. The tanks itself can be a gravity feed, especially if you have a little bit of slope on your project site, or you can configure it to install a water pump that can be fed by a solar array and solar operated, and plumb it out, PVC out of this water tank to run alongside your creekside plantings, and then you can tee off to a watering station. So it's really effective, but it takes a little time to get that set up. On the top in the center here, it's kind of a zoomed out picture, but you can see the water trailer. We've carted these out to sites too. These you can hook up to a drip line, or you can hand water. A little bit more labor intensive, but you're skipping the step of setting up a bunch of infrastructure. And then the bottom right here is just a photo of variable frequency drive pump that we installed for one of our project sites. It's a large farm operation, but to be able to dial down the frequency and the power and the PSI that's going into irrigation, it has been really helpful for us, because we don't need that much, PSI for watering our riparian plants as is needed for the operation. So those are some considerations there. You also want to think about weed protection. And again, the photo on the left is, if you're thinking of a big, large scale riparian planting, you'll have trees and shrubs pretty spread out. So it's helpful to have these little weed mats. We use this coconut fiber weed mat with a cardboard layer on top, or I'm sorry, on the bottom. And these biodegrade over time, but they last a good 2 to 3 years and are really effective at managing weeds. In the center photos here, if you're doing a smaller sort of pollinator plot, a denser planting, we like to lay down this weed fabric layer ahead of time and then plant into it. The top one, again, is the coconut fiber that'll break down over time. Mostly effective. I would say even more effective is the photo on the bottom with the landscaping fabric. Unfortunately, it's plastic. It is super effective, and you got to rip it out later, but it does cut back the time that you spend weeding, which is really helpful. And on the far right, this is what we typically use for our hedgerow projects. A wood chip mulch layer. You try to get that nice and thick, a good 6-inch layer underneath. Bonus, put a cardboard layer underneath. That's really going to help keep with the weeds down, but also with soil moisture retention. And another thing I want to point out in this hedgerow picture is, we think of a single strand hedgerow, but you can do multiple strands. So this is a hedgerow that was planted just this spring, a double strand. The landowner wanted one row next to the roadside that had, taller shrubs and small trees to kind of block out the noise and the dust coming from the road. And then the second strand closer to their crops, lower shrubs, thinking about pollinators, incorporating those species, different types of forbs. So you can get really creative with it. All right, a couple more things to consider in design is your browse protection. And the photo in the center here is sort of a cattle proof. So if you're working on a ranch, you can, get these hog panels, bend them into shape, and stabilize them with a couple T-posts. And that way you can have grazing happening, concurrently with the planting that you're doing. The grazing is extremely helpful to keep back those weeds. I think in Wendell's presentation, there was a mention of flash grazing, so allowing that periodic grazing to keep the weeds back. In the center of this photo, we've got a seed basket. So this is a inexpensive, effective strategy for establishing oak trees, for example. You can plant them with acorns. They grow really well and, in fact, grow a lot faster than a container planting. Photo on the right is, looking again back at our pollinator plots that we've done. We started with a deer fencing around to keep out deer and rabbits. We had to come back in with a hog panel fencing because the hogs came down from the hill and decided that they wanted to scope out the riparian planting. So yeah, just a couple different methods as you're thinking about browse protection. And I'll just mention too, there isn't a good picture of it in here, but if you're planning a riparian project and you do have livestock, you do want to consider potentially putting up wildlife friendly fencing. That's the kind of fencing where you have a smooth strand on the top and the bottom that allows wildlife passage, but keeps livestock out of a creek system while you're getting things established. And then maybe the funnest part of these projects is the planting and picking your plant palette. These are some considerations, spacing to determine your quantity. So in a typical hedgerow, you're working with like a 5-foot spacing. So in a 100-foot hedgerow, you have about 20 plants. Your riparian systems that you're working in, it just depends on how spread out you are and what your project goals want to be there. Thinking about your target species. So are you trying to attract pollinators or certain focal bird species, mammals, and what kind of requirements that they need from the different plants that you can provide. Thinking about wildlife resources and flowering timing. So ideally you're planting plants that flower at different times a year, provide wildlife resources year round, especially as climate change happens and migration patterns change. That's a really important element to consider. Vegetative structure. So what's the function you're trying to achieve? Do you really, want a tall windbreak for your hedgerow, or do you have mature canopy in your riparian system, but you want the more low growing stuff to support other animals? So you can kind of play with that and look at the different sizes that some of these plants will grow. Color and aesthetics, especially with hedgerows, you're probably going to be seeing those on the daily. So, you might consider what kind of colors you want to see or the different greens that come out in the different plant species that you're selecting. And then biodiversity and climate resilience. So again, thinking about increasing as many different species as you can plant, ones that are drought tolerant, ones that can do well in extreme weather events, and so forth. And, factor all of that in so you're building a robust project that will be successful in the long run. And then the photos on the right, this is, if you go to Point Blue's website, we have climate smart restoration tools that you can play with. Enter different plants that you're interested in selecting for your planting, and you'll get a chart that sort of spits out like how it meets those different criteria, and is beneficial to your project. Okay, quickly, just thinking about project prep. We, spending some time doing some grazing or mowing, string trimming before you get those plants in the ground is going to help a great deal to do that work ahead of time. Soil prep, thinking about our hedgerows in particular, making sure that you get mulch. For soil amendments, maybe not so needed in a hedgerow system, but riparian systems or systems where there hasn't been a good organic layer or nutrient input, it's helpful to have soil amendments as you're planting. And then for the hedgerow bed prep, you want to disc those about 6 inches down and prepare the bed like a strawberry bed. So a raised bed that you can plant into. Those plants will settle over time. Having that dirt fluffed up improves aeration and will improve the root growth. So that's not so much needed for riparian systems, but when you're doing a hedgerow bed, that is ideal. Okay, and then the implementation part. So I just want to pitch our STRAW program, Students and Teachers Restoring a Watershed. We're a 31-year-old program based out of Point Blue, and we involve the community, especially students and local schools, to plant restoration projects. So there's that environmental education component. Students, these are professional projects, right? And students are trained, they're supervised, and they learn a lot, and they have a lot of fun on these projects. But I also wanted to mention for straw, a lot of these projects can be large and very intensive. So our program is designed to work with landowners as a one-stop project management, so we can be involved in the planning and design, implementation, that follow-up maintenance, which is so critical for these projects, and then monitoring, reporting. So these are a couple items that we can support through these projects. And then real quickly, I just want to mention again how important maintenance is for these projects. You're protecting that investment that you've put into doing restoration, ensuring success. And that adaptive management piece is really, really big. You can, go back and replant or kind of look how things did. Some of it can be a little bit experimental, and you can learn from it in the process. So the way that STRAW designs our projects, when we're working with landowners, we're typically looking for a 3-year grant. We do implementation and follow-up maintenance for the following 3 years. So we support getting irrigation set up, plant maintenance, so weeding and all that type of work, and then that follow-up monitoring. So you could expect us, in a fully fledged supported project to be out at your farm or your ranch, every week, bi-weekly during the summer, making sure plants are staying weeded and watered. And that really helps take the burden off of the landowner to have to do all that work. Okay, a couple more. So this is really short resources list. There's so much more online, but I just wanted to point to some of the resources Point Blue has on their website. Hedgerows Unlimited. Joanne's partner, Sam Earnshaw, I work with him a lot on some hedgerow design. Xerces Society, so if you're really excited getting those pollinators to your farm or ranch, there's some great resources here. Thinking about funding the Natural Resources Conservation Service through their EQIP program. I linked some information here, the Partners for Fish and Wildlife. If you're looking at installing wildlife-friendly fence, that's a good option there. And I really want to highlight the second bullet here. Point Blue has a restoration block grant that will run through 2026. We're currently looking for hedgerow and riparian projects that benefit wildlife and looking for, interested landowners to work on that right now and hopefully get some applications in and get some funding out to folks who are interested in doing these types of programs. So definitely email that email address or email me. I'd be happy to share some more information and help co-design a project for you. Couple fun slides if you build it. They will come. And these are some pollinator pictures. Amazing. We did a milkweed planting in the last year and had an immediate response of monarch butterflies and caterpillars. And just lastly, thank you for your time. Please do reach out by email or phone if you want to chat about a project. I would be super happy to help. And there's just so much more to talk about that I couldn't fit in here. But usually with working with landowners, we start out with a site visit, so getting a chance to walk around and see what the opportunities are. But let me know. And that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Jenny. That was fantastic. We help growers put in plantings, and I learned a bunch from hearing this presentation, which I'm happy to report. And let's see, are there any questions why don't we start off with questions for Jenny? If there are any, you can just raise your hand and we could call on you, because I don't think there are any in the chat right now for her. Well, I'm really glad that, Jenny, you shared all those different resources, because growers are often wondering where they can get help. And as you showed with your presentation, while growers are good at planting crops, there's a lot of details that aren't exactly the same when you're trying to plant a habitat. And so having somebody like you all out there, and other ZRCs and us can really help growers ensure they're going to have success. Let's see.
Couple questions come in. I can grab a couple of these.
Sure.
Where does the funding for the program come from Point Blue? Right now, we're seeing a lot of state funding. So the Wildlife Conservation Board is funding our Roots program. But we work with State Coastal Conservancy. Yeah, a lot of state grants that come in, and then other private donors and foundations that support the education side of our funding. So I hope that answers that question. Any plant nurseries I can suggest that specialize in native plants? Yes. We're Central Coast region, so Santa Clara, San Benito, or that's where my region is, Monterey and Santa Cruz County. Local nursery here is Central Coast Wilds. They're based in Santa Cruz. They're tremendously excellent. They also have an in-house restoration team as well. When you're sourcing plants for your plantings, ideally you're getting California natives. Again, they're adapted for this climate, but Central Coast Wilds is a great place to start. There's another great nursery up in Richmond, California, the north side of the San Francisco Bay Area, called Watershed Nursery. Gosh, there's many. I'd be happy to provide a list. And then a little bit further south in Santa Margarita is Las Palitas Nursery, is another good one. So happy to recommend some more.
Jenny, while you're looking at that next question, if you go to calscape.org, which is the website for the California Native Plant Society, they've updated their website, and they make it really easy to find nurseries near you for the plants you want to use.
Awesome. Great. I see another shout out to Las Palitas. Yeah, they can ship plants to you. They do a really good job with that, so you don't have to drive to the nursery location. All right.
Okay, it looks like there's some. Are there other questions for the other speakers? Nurseries. Can you recommend any plants as hosts for beneficial predatory species? I could actually answer that. There are some natives. There's a lot of research out there on non-native plants. And we have a publication on our website, Managing Pests, and with predators and parasitoid habitat. The little bit of research that's out there around native plants talks about how ceanothus and toyon and coffeeberry, and perennial buckwheat are all supportive of beneficial insects, and they flower at different times. So you'll have habitat there or food sources, nectar and pollen for them throughout the year. And you can go to our website to find that. Let's see. How would this work for a public urban project? Do you want to take that, Jenny?
Yes. We do work in urban settings, and all of our projects are collaborations with local groups. With urban projects, we've done a lot of sort of invasive plant control and then some replanting efforts. What's nice with the urban projects is you're closer to schools and places where people can have access and be able to reconnect with their planting efforts and get to feel a little bit more involved. Sometimes when we're bringing students out to rangelands and farms, it's a great opportunity. They get to interact that way, but they don't typically get to see the project down the road. I hope that answers the question. I'm happy to elaborate more.
Thank you. And then Hamutahl, I see that you mentioned that small white flowers such as annual buckwheat and alyssum are important, and yarrow also, and phacelia. Do you want to say anything else about that?
No, except that after I wrote annual buckwheat, I was thinking both annual and perennial buckwheat work. But bees and larger pollinators like showy, colorful flowers, parasitoids tend to look for like smaller, wider flowers.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Wendell. Wendell, you showed us those beautiful images of riparian dependent birds and other birds that use riparian habitat. If somebody doesn't know birds, what's the best way for them to learn about them?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. There's a couple of apps that are really good that start out by you can record the bird calls, because most of the time, if you do point counts, and anybody out there that have done point counts, Christian mentioned that you're at a set location for 5 minutes, and you record by distance every bird detected. And most of the time you're detecting by sound and not by sight. So, getting to know the birds' calls is really an important part of being a birder. But there's also the iBird and eBird platforms that are available to people. More recently, there's another one that people have been talking about a lot. I can't recall the name of it. Merlin, yes. Merlin's another one that people have been using quite a lot. So it's a matter. One of the things that I would recommend if you really are interested is, find another birder to go spend some time with, and if birders are always willing to share their time and their expertise to get out in these particular habitats. Birds do typically participate in general habitats, but also there's a lot of them that are really habitat specific, like some of the focal species, the obligates, the yellowthroats and chats, things like that, are always going to be found in and around riparian areas or wetlands. You're not going to see them outside those areas. Marsh wrens, as the name suggests, are in tules and hardstem bulrush in and around wetlands and riparian areas. So a lot of these birds, they're some of the grasshopper sparrow, for example, is almost always in grasslands. So the birds that you see are, habitats that you visit are going to host a specific suite of birds and many times focal species. In California, we have Partners in Flight have put together focal species for oaks, for riparian areas, for the rice growing region, for mountain meadows, for We've got pocket guides for the sagebrush birds and others as well. So, it's just a matter of, taking that step. If anybody, I'm happy to direct you, kind of depending on where you are. There's probably a birder that I know in and around the West that that would be happy to step forward and help guide you through the process of becoming a birder.
Excellent. And then Hamutahl and Christian, your project is just getting going. When can we expect to hear more from you? Will you be releasing results periodically or at the end of your project?
That's a great question. We have about 2 more years of funding, so I imagine we'll release results. We're releasing preliminary results to our growers this summer, but I imagine next summer we'll probably want to put together another public talk, and we'll definitely let you know. We can coordinate with you on that.
Perfect. Yeah, I look forward to hearing more. So, unless there are there more questions in the chat? No, I don't think so. Is there? Yeah, so it looks like Stephen, our colleague at Wild Farm, listed some of the non-native plants that are also good for supporting parasitoid wasps. Yeah, well, I think we should wrap it up. Thank you so much again, speakers, for participating with us on this webinar. And we are recording it, so please share with your friends. And yeah, thanks for participating. Look for other webinars we're going to do this fall, all about beneficial insects and pest control, how holistic farm management impacts pest management. There's going to be a suite of webinars. So thank you again, everyone. Bye.